Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 18. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. I send you happy Native Americans Remembrance Day. That's what I've been telling my friends over the recent holidays, which some people observe as Thanksgiving. Today we will be discussing Steve Biko, the South African freedom fighter, anti-apartheid freedom fighter, who was brutally murdered by the South African regime in 1977 at the age of only 30. So Steve Biko, compared to Nelson Mandela, of course, is not as well known, but he is relatively known to a sizable population outside South Africa. And one of the reasons, of course, was the movie Cry Freedom, which was based on the book written by Donald Woods, who was a white South African reporter who became friends with Steve Biko. And Denzel Washington also starred in that film. I believe that Steve Biko will become much more important in terms of his ideas as we continue to observe the evolution of the post-apartheid state in South Africa. As many of you must know, it has been more than a quarter century since the end of apartheid in South Africa. And yet, the economic system and the wealth distribution is relatively the same as it was during the apartheid era. And that is what Steve Biko had warned against. Biko said, if there's only to be a change of the people in leadership in terms of replacing Europeans with Africans, with black people, and if that is the only change that was to occur, then the system would remain as if it had never changed. And I'll read from a quote that he actually says this later on in this podcast. I say that his ideas will continue to be much more relevant going forward because today, while Europeans make up less than 8% of the population in South Africa, they still control more than 72% of the fertile land in South Africa. So obviously this is an issue that is going to remain with us for quite some time, and that, I think, to me will amount to the second phase of the real struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So the superficial setting of apartheid has ended, where you now have, of course, a black president in the form of Cyril Ramaphosa. But the substructure of the apartheid system still remains relatively intact in South Africa. Now, Steve Biko is well known for what is called black consciousness, and that is what he's most associated with. So let's get actually his own description of what he meant with black consciousness. And this I am reading from one of the chapters from his book, I Write What I Like. Briefly defined, therefore, black consciousness in essence, the realization by the black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their operation, the blackness of their skin, and to operate as a group in order to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. It seeks to demonstrate the lie that black is an aberration from the normal, which is white. And he goes on to say, blacks are out to completely transform the system and to make of it what they wish. Such a major undertaking can only be realized in an atmosphere where people are convinced of the truth inherent in their stand. Liberation, therefore, is of paramount importance in the concept of black consciousness, for we cannot be conscious of ourselves and yet remain in bondage. In terms of the black consciousness approach, we recognize the existence of one major force in South Africa. This is white racism. It is the one force against which all of us are pitted. It works with unnerving totality, featuring both on the offensive and in our defense. Its greatest ally to date has been the refusal by us to club together as blacks, because we are told to do so would be racialist. So while we progressively love ourselves, lose ourselves in a world of colorlessness and amorphous common humanity, whites are deriving pleasure and security in entrenching white racism and further exploiting the minds and bodies of the unsuspecting black masses. So this is a concept which Steve Biko and his allies were propagating and popularizing in South Africa during the 1960s, at a time when, at the same time, black power, black is beautiful concept was also flourishing in the United States. Steve Biko was indeed influenced, and his generation, by events that were also unfolding here in the United States. He was also familiar with the teachings of Malcolm X. He was inspired by Frantz Fanon. He was also inspired by the emerging liberation fighters in other African countries who were fighting for independence in their countries. People like Oginga Odinga in Kenya, people like Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria. So this is the setting in the 1960s. But in order to further understand why it was important for Biko to stress the need for Africans to really embrace their African heritage, their African history, we have to understand what the apartheid system had done in terms of trying to inculcate a sense of black inferiority. At the same time, white supremacy was being promoted. When the apartheid regime became official policy in South Africa in 1948, one of the things the features set up was something called the population register. Under that system, Europeans were on top of the socioeconomic and political ladder. Of course, the black African population was completely disenfranchised, so they could not even vote. But in terms of benefits from the resources of the state, the best resources, the best schools, the best hospitals, the best jobs, the best communities where to live, all of that, the social services went to Europeans. And then after Europeans were so-called coloreds, and those were people of mixed ancestry, Africans and Europeans. And then at the bottom rung were Black Africans. And there was a system whereby people could actually appeal their designation. So this was a big brother state where everybody had an official designation, meaning the whiter you are, the closer you are to whiteness, the better resources that you are eligible to benefit from. So you are allowed to appeal your designation. So if somebody was classified or designated as Black African, that person could actually go to court and challenge their designation and insist that they were actually not Black African and that they were in fact colored. And if their appeal was successful, they would be designated as colored, meaning they would be entitled to more benefits, better resources from the state, better privileges, better advantages. Similarly, if somebody was designated as colored and felt they were indeed white, European, they could also challenge that designation and insist to the court, to the judge, that they were in fact not colored, but white. So you can see where this is going. The system had built in this whole phenomena whereby rejecting blackness was the only way that somebody could advance in life, socioeconomically, politically, and everything else in South Africa. So imagine, what does that say to a young African Black growing up in South Africa? That you must reject your Blackness and Africanness in order to be successful in life. Just reflect upon that for a minute. So generation after generation, this would be something which is profoundly harmful. Now, instead of focusing on fighting the apartheid racist system of white supremacy, you're actually inferiorizing yourself and fighting against yourself, trying to remove yourself from your Africanness. So that is why Steve Biko believed in order to fight this system, we must first liberate the mind of Africans. And that is therefore why he was pushing Black consciousness in the 1960s. Steve Biko was born in 1946. That's 2 years before apartheid became the official policy of South Africa. And of course, the regime was sustained with massive support from the West, primarily the United States, because of the multinational corporations and their investments in the mining industry in South Africa. So Steve Biko's father died when he was only 4 years old, and he had 3 siblings. So the only source of income was his mother, who was a cook in a hospital. So that really had profound impact on Steve Biko in terms of always wanting to work on behalf of the working class people in South Africa. And by the 1960s, he is now in medical school. He's a very bright student. He performed very well in high school. His academic career was almost derailed when in high school, Biko and an older brother were arrested and they were interrogated by the police, accused of belonging to the armed wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, led by Robert Sobukwe, who was a university lecturer. And Sobukwe will be the subject of one of our subsequent podcasts as well. But ultimately, he does make it to the university. He goes to what was called the non-European section of the medical school in the University of Natal in South Africa. Now, when he gets to university, he starts participating in what was called the National Union of Student Associations, NUSA, in South Africa. Then he noticed a contradiction which really begins to bother him a lot. That the apartheid regime is imposed by Europeans in South Africa. And NUSAS, the National Union of Student Associations, was also led by Europeans. And he thought that contradiction could not be resolved unless another organization was formed, which ultimately he was instrumental in forming. And that was called the South African Students' Organizations. And he was instrumental in forming that organization, and primarily it was composed of Black leadership. But even though in its manifesto it said the organization was for Black students, it was actually not exclusively for Black students. So in other words, Indians were also allowed to be members, as well as the so-called coloreds, people of mixed ancestry, European and Black. SASO, S-A-S-O, South African Students Organization, that was the official name of this organization, co-founded by Steve Biko in 1968. And one other reason that really made him resolve to find this organization was when he attended one of the meetings organized by the National Union of Students Associations that was governed by Europeans. He was invited to be a speaker, and then when he got to the location where the national conference was to be held, and they just arrived, and they found out that accommodation had been made, sleeping arrangements had been made for only the Europeans, students who had come to the conference, the colored students, and the Indians. No arrangements had been made for Black African students. They were told that they could go and sleep in a nearby church. Well, Steve Biko said enough is enough and walked out of that conference. And from there, went on to co-found the organization SASO, which primarily was led by Black African students. In the beginning, the apartheid regime actually did not mind and actually welcomed that, because the apartheid regime felt this conformed with the official policy of segregation and separateness. But of course, Steve Biko had larger plans. His agenda in terms of founding that organization was just to make sure that Africans were in the driver's seat in terms of defining the destiny of the struggle in the apartheid regime. He was not out to create a separate apartheid African state. In fact, he was very critical of a policy called Bantustans, which South Africa was also implementing. South Africa was designating some areas within South Africa as quote unquote independent African states called Bantustans, and was founding puppet African quote unquote leaders to rule those Bantustans. Transkei, Siskay, Venda, Bophuthatswana. These are some of the names of these phony states created by South Africa, which was not recognized by any country in the world except South Africa itself. So Biko rejected that type of balkanization and division of Africans. So obviously his vision was for a unified, non-racialist South Africa. But he felt he needed to found SASO so that Africans, young students, Africans could be in charge of guiding their new destiny. And then he co-founded 2 other organizations to help effectively promote Black consciousness. The first was called Black People's Convention, BPC. And the other was called Black Communities Programs, BCP. So the convention was more political, allowing chapters to be formed all over the country, and then sending people to talk about the meaning of Black consciousness, to elevate the consciousness of Africans throughout the country in terms of the importance of embracing their African heritage and traditions in the struggle against apartheid, and thereby dispelling that whole concept of white superiority and white supremacy. The second organization was more focused on practical programs throughout African communities in South Africa. And this included literacy programs, included building clinics to treat the urban African population. It included practical activities such as dressmaking, such as leather works, basically to create employment and productive activity for Africans in all these communities. He also created a scholarship fund for bright students. He also created a fund for the families of political prisoners in South Africa. So obviously now the apartheid regime realizes that this is a dangerous individual. Biko is now spending all of his time devoted to anti-apartheid work. And is also affecting, he was married in 1970, and all this activity keeping him so busy, occupied, is also affecting his, putting strain on his marriage. Biko is now being monitored by the state under surveillance. The state starts arresting him and detaining him with no charges. He starts getting death threats, and young people start protecting him, walking around with him as bodyguards. The youth who are protecting him, they call themselves the Cubans. These are young South Africans who try to always be around him to provide him some protection and security. One thing that Steve Biko also felt very strongly about, and ultimately, this is also something that indirectly cost him his life at the end, was he wanted to see a unification of all the organizations engaged in fighting the apartheid regime. So he met the leaders of the African National Congress, the ANC. Obviously, by that time, Nelson Mandela is already serving his life sentence after he had been convicted in 1963 in the Rivonia trials. And all these organizations had already been banned as well after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. Well over hundreds, and the exact count is actually not even known of today, of young people, primarily students, who had been massacred by the police after they protested against carrying the pass, which was called the pass laws. It's a form of internal passport that every Black person had to carry with them in South Africa. And when they had that strike, the intention was to go to the police and surrender those pass cards and submit themselves to be arrested That march was actually organized by Robert Sobukwe, and the police were aware that that was the intention. And yet the police claimed a threatening crowd came and ended up massacring all those people in the Sharpeville massacre. So by that time, the ANC has been banned. The PAC had also been banned. So in addition to meeting the leadership of the ANC, which was underground in South Africa, there were also plans to try to smuggle Biko out of the country so he could meet Oliver Tambo, who was the president of the ANC and was already in exile at that time. He also met with Sobukwe himself, Robert Sobukwe, the leader of the PAC, and he's urging them all to unite so that they can be one powerful force fighting against the apartheid regime. And ultimately, he then tries to meet a leader of what was called the um, Unity Movement, and his name is Neville Alexander, and he's in Cape Town. Steve Biko had been officially banned, meaning he was only confined to his own town, which was called Williamstown in South Africa. He could not move beyond there. He could not meet with more than one person at a time under the ban. He could not address a gathering. He could not belong to an organization. He could not be quoted in any of the media. So he could not even be quoted in the newspapers. That was the ban that Steve Biko faced. But then, in August 1977, he travels with a colleague to Cape Town, wanting to meet with Neville Alexander, the leader of the Unity Movement, and also try to talk with him about the need for unity amongst all the fighting organizations in South Africa. Now, on his way back from Cape Town, the car is stopped at a roadblock and he is identified and he is arrested. When he's taken to the police cell and ultimately to police headquarters in Cape Town, he is stripped naked, he is handcuffed, he's shackled, he is interrogated for 22 hours straight, he is beaten viciously, and he suffers brain hemorrhage. And yet, even after that, he is forced to stand on his feet for hours. On September 11, 1977, he's tossed into the back of a Land Rover, which is a form of a cruiser, and he's driven 740 miles, naked, shackled, and obviously in pain and distress, driven to a hospital, a prison hospital. And that is on the 11th of September. And of course, not surprisingly, he ends up dead on September 12th, 1977, from the injuries sustained. There are reports that his head was banged against the wall multiple times by the police officers interrogating him, and that is ultimately what killed Steve Biko. I want to read from an interview that Steve Biko gave, and that interview is on YouTube. So if you search Steve Biko interview, it's a short interview, about 24 minutes. And this is one thing that he says when the interviewer asked him about his vision for South Africa and said, I believe you're a socialist. And Steve Biko said, yes, I believe in socialism as the way forward for South Africa. And this is part of what he says. There's no running away from the fact that in South Africa, there's such an ill distribution of wealth that any form of political freedom which does not touch on the proper distribution of wealth will be meaningless. The whites have locked up within a small minority of themselves the greater proportion of the country's wealth. And if we have a mere change of face of those in governing positions, what is likely to happen is that Black people will continue to be poor, and we'll get a few Blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie, and our society will be run almost as of yesterday. So that for meaningful change to occur, there needs to be an attempt at reorganizing the whole economic pattern and economic policies within this particular country. BPC, Black People's Convention, believes in a judicial blending of private enterprise, which is highly diminished, and state participation in industry and commerce, especially on industries like mining, gold, diamond, asbestos, and so on, like forestry, and of course, complete ownership of land. Now, in that kind of judicial blending of the two systems, we hope to arrive at a more equitable distribution of wealth. Obviously, that has not occurred in South Africa, and that is why I say that the real revolution in South Africa is yet to occur. It is not surprising that a group such as the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is the party led by Julius Malema, over the years is gaining more support. And in fact, it is because of its position in terms of taking the land and redistributing land to landless, poor, working class Africans in South Africa without compensation, because as he says, originally the land was stolen by the Europeans that colonized South Africa in the first place. Now, for the first time, the ANC, the African National Congress, has been pushed further to the left, and is now actually, for the first time, talking about land redistribution without compensation for the first time. So that is something that we should all keep a close eye on as South Africa continues to evolve in this post-apartheid state. I also want to read something very quickly from what Donald Woods, the European journalist, wrote in terms of Steve Biko. And this here he's referring to Black consciousness. Quote, while they